This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to do something that we haven't done in a while. I've got a little Q&A prepared. I have two questions that are actually quite excellent, having to do with things that seem to threaten photography as we know it. So let's get started. So first up, we have a DM that I got from a gentleman named Chris, who asks, "Dear Ted, I don't think you've ever talked about AI technology on the channel. I would love to hear your thoughts on computer-generated imaging, and if you think this could be a legitimate threat to photography in the future. Thank you in advance." So fair enough question, and no, it is not something I have talked a lot about on this channel before. I've talked a little bit about AI, but it's usually in the context of image editing, and the question here pertains to actual computer-generated photography, so to speak, that we're starting to see really in the last year. There's been several companies that come along, and much like ChatGPT, it's like you give the algorithm a series of prompts, and it spits out images that match the criteria that you've given it. So if you haven't actually used or seen this yet, it actually is pretty impressive. One, that it can be done, but two, it's also kind of scary. And three, I think it's just kind of strange too. A lot of times you get back like pictures of people and they've got 11 fingers on each hand. And usually even a landscape photo, there's just something that's just a little too surreal about it that keeps it from being an actual photograph. But it's really impressive that this is the beginning of something, and it is very scary to see where this could possibly lead. Do I think it's going to replace photography? That becomes a more complicated type of question. There was a very interesting piece on this on CBS Sunday Morning recently where they had people talking about both sides of this, but the whole idea is that you have an algorithm that's smart enough to start inventing stuff. And so you give it criteria. I would like a landscape image with the sun going down in the back and a person in the front, and you give it criteria. And then they would say things like, in the style of the illustrator Norman Rockwell. And of course the algorithm does its thing and it returns images pretty close to what you asked for. Now, at this point in time, they're fairly crude, but you can start to see where this is going. The fact that I mentioned Norman Rockwell in here raises a secondary question is, one, where are some of these companies getting all of their photo data from? Because clearly, two, it does know who Norman Rockwell is, which actually brings up the question of copyright. Now, you're not looking at an Ansel Adams image or you're not looking at a Norman Rockwell painting, but you're looking at something in the style of. So clearly those things have been fed into the algorithm. So there's a lot of stuff like that that starts to become questionable. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not a big fan of this stuff because I think, one, there's nothing creative about this. It's fairly lazy. It's somebody sitting at a computer punching in something, and you're getting stuff that looks kind of sort of close to what you were talking about that comes back. It's impressive that it can do it, and I think the bigger issue here is it's something that's going to continue to improve, and it's going to get really good in the future. I think one of the biggest issues in here is, will this be a threat to commercial photography? And actually, I'm going to back up just a second because this has actually happened before, and it happens in any industry as technology comes along. And it actually changes the way we work. It allows us to do things more efficiently. And unfortunately, sometimes that includes people who do things for a living on the side that starts to go away. Let me give you an example. So when I was a kid growing up in the 80s, there was this thing that kept every creative in business once a year called the annual report. Every large company was required by law to do this annual report. This was before the internet. So these were published things. It wasn't quite like a book. It looked like a magazine-sized publication, and it would have everything in there from the company's financial statements, their numbers, their successes, their outreach programs, just everything that pertained to what the company was doing in that particular year. There were literally design studios in Dallas, in every major market for that matter, that existed because of annual reports. They would have several clients that they would do these annual reports for. They would hire photographers to do all the photography. They would hire illustrators to come help with these things. Like, so for instance, if you were a photographer in Dallas in the 80s and you did annual report stuff, let's say an oil company put two drills in, I don't know, in the Indian Ocean. And so we needed photographs of those because they were done this last year for the annual report. So they would hire photographers to actually fly halfway around the world to get these images and bring them back. And this was a huge deal. People had an enormous amount of pride with this. There was a lot of money in it, and the work was really good. This was something, though, that by the late 80s, 90s, the internet comes along, and of course people's budgets are decreasing, and this little thing called stock photography comes along, where you have photographers who have large catalogs of work. They own all the rights to it, and so you have a stock agency that comes along, somebody like Getty Images, for instance, who, when you're an art director or a graphic designer and you're putting together a large project, well, you have two choices. Well, we can send a photographer all the way to the Indian Ocean to shoot that oil rig, or we can get a stock photo that already exists. So the stock photo we can download from the internet today, and it costs $60, and the photographer is going to cost several $1,000s, and it's going to take a month to get that done, or at the very minimum, a couple weeks. So you can kind of see the direction that everybody goes in. So stock photography was a huge, or it had a huge impact on the commercial photography business in general. So does that mean that commercial photography does not exist anymore because of stock? Well, no, not at all. In fact, I have 3 friends that are very successful photographers. The reason that they are is that they've developed success within a niche that you cannot replace with stock photography. So if you think of things that you can't get a stock photo to replace, it would be things like portraits, product shots, celebrity images, especially when you get into endorsements. There's no stock photo that exists. You need to go shoot it. I have a really good friend who's developed a really successful business as an architectural photographer. He works with several architectural firms. When they finish a building and they do really interesting, really cool stuff, they will send him out to go photograph it. They don't have stock photography that exists, and they want to be able to control that element. So the business did not get replaced so much, but it changed. And if we look at now what we're looking at with AI, this is where I wanted to arrive at, then how does this impact things? Okay, so I obviously can't predict the future, so this is just my opinion on where things are and where I see them going and what I believe, and I'd love to hear what you guys have to say on this too. Please feel free to leave a comment. But I think that in general, when we look at what's going on here, and I mentioned earlier that piece I saw on CBS Sunday Morning where they had criteria they gave the computer and it spat out some images in the style of somebody they asked for. And so what we're seeing here is computer technology that's completely dependent on being fed things that have come before. In other words, the computer itself and the algorithm, they're not creative. They're having to be told what to do. Now, it is scary, the level of stuff that they're able to learn, but in my own opinion, I don't think you're going to get it to where it's actually going to drive something into a new area. In other words, it's like working with a photographer who hasn't kept up in a few years and they're still a few years behind. There's no way that we can advance photography as an art form, at least, with this certain criteria. It's just a computer's not going to do that type of thinking. I don't know what this means for commercial work necessarily, but just like when stock came along and changed everything, I think that photographers who want to work commercially are going to have to rethink what that means and rethink what they can do. And they're going to have to look for opportunities that are not replaceable. I think the other interesting thing where I don't think you're going to see any replacement at all is when we get into the art world. Of course, the art world is more of my expertise since what I've spent the last 15 years building this channel on. But with what I've seen with AI so far is, again, we have a computer algorithm that's simply being able to do what it's told. It's just on a very advanced level. But if you look at what art is and what art means, art is a representation of where we are as a society, where we are at our point in history, the ideas that we have, the concerns that we have, the worries that we have, the solutions that are proposed, sometimes the argument that we have against it, the controversy. These are certain things that have always defined art. This is why you can look at a past master painting and say, this looks like it's from about 1750 or so. Or if you look at a photograph and you say, well, this is clearly the 1960s. You look at the fashion, you look at what the photograph is saying, how it's photographed, the style that it's in, the technology that's being used. All of this comes into this amalgamation of who we are as people, and that's what art is, and that's what art will always be moving forward. One could argue that AI has been kind of a particular trend that has maybe affected or influenced it at some point, but it doesn't take it over. And that's my point, is that human beings, no matter what comes along, we have this inherent desire and need to be creative. And if you have that within you and you're interested in photography, you're going to find a way to create something no matter what. Now, I'm talking about the art side of it. We were talking about the commercial side earlier, and I don't really know how all of this shakes out, but I really am not afraid that things are going to be replaced by artificial intelligence. I just don't. As for what we're seeing with artificial intelligence now, I have pretty much zero interest in it at all. There's not much creative about somebody sitting in front of a computer and giving it some words and then seeing this weird, bizarre entertainment of images being fed back. They're certainly not going to be good enough to use in a commercial application. They're certainly not fooling anybody at this point. Again, you could watch this video in the future and think, boy, Ted sure is eating his words here, because it could probably get really good. Is it going to get really good in the sense that it actually is going to replace what it is that we already do? Time will tell, but my feeling is no. So those are my thoughts, and please leave me yours and we can discuss this more in future videos. I have another question that I want to get to about another thing that is threatening photography, but real quick, I want to give a shout out to our awesome sponsor this week, who are the awesome folks over at Squarespace. Listen, you need a website, and we all know how much work that is to build and maintain, but it doesn't have to be. Squarespace is by far the easiest way to build your online presence. It's also the best way to grow a business that works for you without having to write a single line of code. Do you just need a simple portfolio or a blog to showcase your work? Well, Squarespace is perfect. Featuring a drag and drop interface. It's intuitive, it allows you to build galleries quickly and update your site with ease. Are you running a business? Well, Squarespace gives you additional tools for things like appointment scheduling, private member areas, social media tools, and even advanced email marketing. Do you sell products or services? Well, Squarespace has you covered with complete tools to power your store, from merchandising to checkout, so that you can sell, ship, and build your customer base. You can even sell classes or manage appointments through your website. And with Squarespace extensions, you can easily sync with third parties to manage, optimize, and enhance your website. From social media integration to SEO, Squarespace gives you all the tools you need to grow a business that works for you. So head over to Squarespace and sign up for the free trial. Start with one of their award-winning templates and see what you can create and just how good you're going to look. When you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/AOP and I can save you an additional 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Just use offer code AOP on checkout. So give it a try and see if Squarespace is right for you. And I want to give a special shout out and thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Okay, so next up, we're going to talk about copyright, intellectual property, and legal matters, another very fun topic for photographers. So this is actually a question, it was two different questions referencing the same article. So essentially there was this article on Petapixel. The headline was, "A photographer who sued a company for removing copyright metadata from his photos before posting them on travel websites had his case dismissed, and the Supreme Court has denied to hear his appeal." So a gentleman named Jack hit me up on Twitter and he wrote, "Appreciate that you don't tend to delve into political/legal issues too much, but is this significant implications for photographers by any chance?" I had somebody else that sent me a direct message and they referenced the article and wanted to know if I could chime in on the legal aspects of this. I should add that I am not a lawyer and I don't give legal advice, but I did read through the article because I was curious. Now, I think part of the problem and what makes this confusing is the title and the information that's coming out, because I think in general, when we hear about photographers in legal battles and Supreme Court refusing to hear things, usually the photographer's the one getting screwed. And this happens to a lot of other creatives, whether you're a musician, a photographer, an illustrator, a writer, whatever it is that you do. We're into the creative side, not the legal side, and unfortunately you hear stories of that happening a lot. That's not exactly what's going on in this particular case. All right, so to give you the gist of this article, you have this gentleman who's a photographer who specializes in shooting resorts and travel type things. He signed a deal with two different hotels where he actually licensed his images for them to use. What happened was they actually, when they were putting them on websites, stripped out all of the copyright data unknowingly, supposedly, because they were trying to optimize the size of the images for fast loading on the internet, which totally actually makes sense. He was paid for the images because you get about halfway down this article and it says years earlier, Elias, who's the photographer in question, extended broad licenses to these two hotels to reproduce and distribute his photographs in unlimited qualities for an unlimited time in any format, including on third-party booking websites. Believe what this photographer was doing was getting them on a technicality, which basically states as part of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that metadata has to stay intact. In other words, the buyer of the art in this case, or the client, can't strip that out for further use, which is a very weird thing to keep track of, but I understand photographers are in it to make money and it's the law and they don't want that interpreted another way, so he went after him. The courts, however, were saying that this was a little obscure and the client didn't have any knowledge of this, which could possibly be true as well, and so that's why they've chosen not only to throw it out, but they're not going to appeal it up to a higher court at this point. Now, folks, as I mentioned earlier, I am not an attorney. I do not play one on TV. I do not give legal advice. However, I do know, as a business owner, as a creative, anytime that you are doing something that is very important, you should hire an attorney, someone who does know what they're doing, who is an expert in that field. That would be a very good idea because stuff like this happens. Sure, he may have been in the right on the technicality, but the court role is to interpret what's going on. The way I see it is like this. We have a series of laws, and when something is a law, it defines what you can or can't do. If you decide to go against that law, then that is what we call illegal. Now, the role of a court is to actually interpret these because even though the law is black and white, not every situation is black and white, and so that's why it's on a case-by-case basis to try to get to the bottom of something, and that's where all the technicalities and the interpretive aspects all come together in all of this stuff. And does it seem fair sometimes? It depends on which side you're on. Only thing I can say is that if something is important to you, it's probably a good idea to consult an attorney. This costs money, and this is why sometimes people don't do it. But for instance, if you do photography for a living and you have a business that does that, and it's important to your business, sometimes you have to do those things as part of your business. It's just a good idea. Another aspect of this from my own personal experience is anything that becomes a legal entanglement like this, and I know everybody's different, has different opinions. Personally, I think this guy probably was being a little heavy-handed going after his client, trying to sue them, especially when they've already hired him and paid him. That's a good way to never get hired again. That's just my personal thinking. And anytime you get into legal entanglements, it will cost money, and the people who are definitely guaranteed to make money are the attorneys in any situation. So sometimes you have to just kind of cut your losses and feel what's comfortable enough for you. Sure, there may have been a legal thing where he had a little bit of a gotcha, but the court didn't interpret that way, and he probably is out fees for the attorneys and the filings. So yeah, contracts are pretty solid, and it's a pretty good idea to have everything spelled out that needs to be. And sometimes that's where getting an attorney is going to benefit you in the end. So I responded to Jack on Twitter, but I thought it would be an interesting topic to cover here as well. And if you guys have any questions, let me know. I don't talk about intellectual property or copyright very much, and it is something that's very interesting. It's something that affects us all as photographers. I think especially in the age of the internet, I mean, I can tell you if you put work online, you probably had it ripped off. I've been ripped off before. Most successful people that I know have. So it's something that affects us all. So if you have any questions, drop them below. Until the next video, I will catch you guys then. Until then, later.